It is 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The findings of the Warren Commission on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy may now be disclosed to the public. Chapter 1 begins. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, was a cruel and shocking act of violence directed against a man, a family, a nation, and against all mankind. In 300,000 words of lean and orderly language, the Warren Commission makes these major findings. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. He did it alone. He was not a part of any conspiracy, either domestic or foreign. In arriving at its findings, the Commission sharply criticizes the Secret Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Dallas Police Department, and members of the press, radio, and television. As a result of its study, the Commission has made a number of recommendations for protecting the President in the future. We begin with Robert MacNeil and the events of the assassination.
At 11:40 a.m., November 22nd last year, President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived at Dallas Airport. There was a noisy, friendly welcome from a large crowd as they took their seats in an open convertible. The plastic bubble top had been left off because of warm weather. Mrs. Kennedy, who had suddenly become as enthusiastic a political campaigner as her husband, wore a pink suit as vivid as her smile and held a bunch of deep red roses. Everywhere, the crowds were bigger, the reception warmer than the city, nervous in case of right-wing demonstrations, had expected. Then, a few seconds past this building, 3 shots. In the motorcade behind the president, there was no way of knowing what had happened. On the grass beside the road, people were crouched for safety. A high wail compounded of many screams filled the air. For several minutes, there was complete confusion, with people running in every direction. The motorcade hesitated, then rushed off. Some thought the shots came from the Texas School Book Depository. Others, including several policemen, ran up the grass slope to the railroad overpass. Gradually, it became clearer. There was nothing suspicious on the tracks, and all the attention turned to the brick building. Police reinforcements moved in, and witnesses told of a gunman at a 6th-floor window. As word came back that the president was gravely wounded, police moved upstairs and found the place where the assailant waited and fired. They found 3 spent cartridges and later a rifle. As the tail end of the motorcade reached Parkland Memorial Hospital, doctors had all but lost their fight to revive the president. With a massive wound in the brain, he was beyond recovery on arrival at the emergency room. Announcement of his death was withheld briefly.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. He died of a gunshot wound in the brain. I have no other details regarding the assassination of the president.
The first wound described was a wound in the back of the head, and which seemed to indicate a shot from behind. But the doctors also said there was a wound in the throat at the front, which seemed to indicate a shot from the other direction. This apparent contradiction, the head wound indicating a bullet from behind, the throat wound indicating a bullet from in front, was basic to the structure of rumor and supposition that's been growing for the last 10 months. It supposed at least 2 gunmen firing from 2 directions, but that supposed any flavor of plot that the market would bear. The Parkland doctors were persuaded by later evidence that the throat wound they at first presumed was made by a bullet going in was probably made by a bullet coming out. The public and the press got only selected leaks about the later evidence, not full details, until tonight. What really happened on these few hundred feet of Dallas roadway in the few wild seconds after 12:30 on November 22nd? The Commission admits it is still not completely sure, but its conclusions, what the report calls its reasoned judgment, is massively supported. Just how the FBI went about reconstructing what did happen is interesting. The most important evidence is a roll of amateur movie film taken by a Dallas dress shop owner, Abraham Zapruder. Because film moves through a movie camera at a certain speed, the passage of time in every movement on the film can be measured. Thus, one of the most disputed questions, the speed the president's car was taking as the shots were fired, was established, and it averaged 11.2 miles per hour. 2 other vital questions have been in dispute. How many shots were fired and where they came from? The Commission concludes that 3 shots were fired, all of them from this 6th-floor window in the Texas School Book Depository. and that none came from anywhere else.
The Warren Commission recreates the shooting in Dallas and attempts to answer hard questions about the bullets involved when Time and Again continues. In the years since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, some of the most persistent questions have focused on the forensic evidence. How many bullets were fired? What was their trajectory? Which bullets caused which wounds in the president and Governor Connally? The Warren Commission issued its answers 10 months after the shooting, on September 27, 1964. We continue now with that night's special report from NBC News.
Shortly after, the president's car turned this corner and reached this spot, the first bullet struck. 2 Secret Service men turned to their rear. Most bystanders have not yet reacted. In this photograph, the president's hand can just be seen as he raises it to his neck. In the FBI reenactment, the crosshairs of the assassin's telescopic sight center on a spot just right of the backbone on the president's shoulder. The bullet entered here, came out just below the president's Adam's apple. The commission believes that the same bullet then entered the right shoulder of Governor Connally, passed out through his chest, continued through his right wrist, and on into his left thigh. The evidence for this conclusion is highly technical and detailed. The trajectory was reconstructed from holes in the president's jacket and shirt and a corresponding wound in his shoulder. The autopsy traced the passage of the bullet through the president's body to a hole in the front of his neck. A corresponding hole consistent with an exiting bullet was found in the president's shirt front, and his tie just here was nicked. There was confusion about whether the wound in front was possibly caused by a bullet entering. The confusion arose because of the haste with which the doctors at Parkland Memorial Hospital necessarily examined that wound. The confusion was increased because the same hole was surgically enlarged to allow insertion of a tube to assist breathing. Evidence similarly gathered supported the conclusion that the same bullet wounded Governor Connally. Tests with bullets of the same kind fired from the same rifle into animal tissue of the same resistance as the president's neck showed that the bullet would not have been slowed down so much going through the president's neck that it could not have been going fast enough to cause Governor Connally's wounds. But it had lost enough velocity to cause it to yaw or wobble slightly so that it made a bigger entry wound in the governor's back than a bullet coming straight from the muzzle of a gun, a pristine bullet as it's called, would have done. This top view shows the presumed trajectory of the bullet as it passed through Governor Connally's back, chest, wrist, and thigh. A nearly whole bullet was found on Governor Connally's stretcher at the hospital and was presumed to have fallen out of the thigh wound. Less than 3 grams of its original weight was missing, and small fragments were recovered from the governor's wrist. The next bullet which struck was fired no more than 5.6 seconds later, by which time the car had reached approximately this spot. The FBI film shows the man representing the president slumped forward, his head tilted downwards. The assassin's view shows him leaning to the left against Mrs. Kennedy. The autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington revealed a small entry wound here, or here if you look at it from another view. It came through the top of the head and caused this massive brain and skull damage here when it went out, an explosion as it was called by some witnesses. Tests with reconstructed skulls, the same type of bullets and again the actual gun, showed similar brain damage in the test materials. So what the report says is that probably 3 shots were fired, although some witnesses thought they heard more. That all came from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Although some witnesses thought there were shots from the railway overpass, there were none. That 2 of the shots hit the president, the first probably also wounded Governor Connally. And that the 3rd shot, although not necessarily fired third, missed altogether. That the shots were fired in a time span of between 4.8 to 7.9 seconds, depending on which shot missed.
The commission thus reached a firm conclusion that the shots which killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connally were fired from the 6th floor window at the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository building, that no other shots were fired from any other location. The commission then turned to the questions of who fired the shots, from what weapon, the evidence to establish the man and the weapon on the 6th floor, his apprehension and detention. Tom Pettit, who saw much of this happen in Dallas, reviews the commission's evidence against Oswald.
The Warren Commission concludes without equivocation that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and Patrolman J.D. Tippit. It has sorted out the evidence from the confusion of November 1963.
Full name is Lee Harvey Oswald, O-S-W-A-L-D.
Hold up a minute, let's get one shot. Let's get one statement, please. I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about. I'll kill the president. No, sir, I didn't keep it. Sir?
You're the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man!
Come on, man.
President?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. What time do you leave? I'm just a patsy.
I'm just a patsy, declared Lee Harvey Oswald. Taken into custody just hours after the Kennedy assassination and murdered himself fewer than 48 hours later, Oswald to the end denied any involvement in the shooting, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. More on that evidence as detailed by the Warren Commission when Time and Again continues. Lee Harvey Oswald was 24 years old in November 1963. By most accounts, he was a little man with big ideas about himself. He had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959 when he was just a teenager. 3 years later, he was back in the United States, disillusioned, embittered, and broke. His marriage was falling apart. His Russian-born wife barely spoke to him. On October 16, 1963, he took a job at the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas for $1.25 an hour. 5 weeks later, the president's car drove by.
I've been photographing a teacher, and now they're taking me to take a line out among these men. That will be kicked out. Right? Very good.
Oswald's 2 index fingerprints and his palm prints turned out to be vital. The paraffin test to determine whether Oswald had fired a weapon was inconclusive, but the report says paraffin tests always are unreliable. The 6.5 millimeter rifle found in the depository was, in the commission's judgment, indisputably linked to Oswald. It is easy to buy a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The Warren Commission says Lee Oswald bought one, that he was skillful enough to use it, and did use it to kill the president. The nearly whole bullet recovered and the 2 larger bullet fragments were fired from this rifle. 3 cartridge cases found on the depository 6th floor were from this rifle. The commission says Oswald bought the rifle under a false name from Klein's Sporting Goods Company of Chicago. Handwriting experts stated categorically that the name A. Heidel on the money order was in Lee Oswald's handwriting. The alias Heidel was used on a forged selective service card and other documents carried by Oswald at the time of his arrest.
One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence the Warren Commission had against Lee Harvey Oswald was a partial palm print, identified as Oswald's, discovered on the rifle found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But there was other evidence as well. Here again is NBC's Tom Pettit in 1964.
FBI experts who found cloth fibers in a crevice between the butt plate of the barrel and the stock of the rifle concluded that those fibers, after very careful investigation, could have come from the shirt worn by Oswald when he was arrested. Photographs of Oswald holding a rifle were intensively scrutinized and subjected to photographic analysis. It was concluded that the rifle was of the same configuration as the C-2766, not definitely the same rifle, but at least definitely Oswald, not his face superimposed as he had claimed. Marina Oswald, who testified that she took the photograph, also said she first found the rifle when she and her husband lived in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, that she had later seen it wrapped in a blanket in the garage at the home of Mrs. Ruth Payne, with whom she lived in the Dallas suburb of Irving.
Oswald was living alone in a room near his job at the depository. A co-worker, Wesley Frazier, a neighbor of Mrs. Payne, usually gave Oswald a ride to Irving on Fridays and brought him back to work on Mondays. Thursday, November 21st, Oswald broke the pattern, rode to Irving with Frazier, telling him he was going to pick up some curtain rods for an apartment in Dallas. Friday, November 22nd, Oswald rode back to work with Frazier and was seen carrying a long paper bag into the depository. After the assassination, a paper bag was found alongside the window from which the shots were fired. 3 fingerprint experts found Oswald's right palm print and left index fingerprint on the bag. Other experts said the homemade bag consisted of materials available in the depository shipping room. Fibers found in the bag were analyzed. An FBI expert said they probably came from that blanket in Mrs. Payne's garage where the rifle had been stored. The commission concluded Oswald carried the disassembled rifle into the building in that bag. FBI and independent fingerprint experts found Oswald had left 2 palm prints and a fingerprint on boxes near the 6th floor window. The palm print was described as fresh. The commission regarded these prints as valuable in reaching the conclusion that Oswald was at the window from which the shots were fired. He had been seen on the 6th floor just before noon. And a man named Howard L. Brennan, who marked this picture for the commission, testified he literally saw Oswald fire the final shot from the 6th floor window, point A, and that he saw other people in a 5th floor window, point B. A photograph taken when the motorcade was passing shows the other men, but not Oswald. The commission says it does not base its conclusion about Oswald from Brennan's testimony anyway. But it did go to elaborate lengths to show that Oswald could have walked out of the building, that he did have time to get from the 6th floor to the 2nd floor, where he was stopped briefly by a police officer. A stopwatch timing of a reenactment by the officer and a stand-in for Oswald is cited as proof.
Welcome back to Time and Again as we look back on the death of John F. Kennedy and the Warren Commission report on the assassination, released on September 27, 1964. The Warren Commission's investigation involved a visit to Dallas to see the crime scene firsthand, visiting Dealey Plaza, walking along Elm Street, examining the infamous grassy knoll, the fence on top, the rail yard beyond, and the bridge at the underpass. All sites from which some witnesses believed they had heard gunshots. The commission found no credible evidence of shots fired from those sites. On the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, where 3 spent rifle cartridges had been recovered, commission members got an assassin's eye view through a telescopic rifle sight. They also rode along the motorcade route. 2 weeks later, the Secret Service and the FBI staged a reenactment of the assassination. The forensic information produced was used to illustrate the commission's conclusions. On June 7, 1964, Supreme Court Chief Justice and Commission Chairman Earl Warren, along with Commission member and future President Gerald R. Ford, spent more than 2 hours at the School Book Depository building. At the Dallas City Jail, Warren and Ford took the testimony of the alleged assassin's killer, Jack Ruby. The Warren report concluded, of course, that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed the president. But Oswald's own murder 2 days after the president's meant that there would never be a confession, a trial, or closure to the endless doubts, questions, and suspicions surrounding the president's assassination. Here again is NBC's Robert MacNeil.
Was Oswald involved in a conspiracy or a plot with any other person, group, or foreign power? The speculation was not without some justification. Right-wing groups in Dallas had drawn national attention by insulting Vice President Johnson and Ambassador Adlai Stevenson and accusing President Kennedy himself of treason. Oswald himself, a former defector to the Soviet Union, came to public attention in New Orleans on a radio program.
Are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
Later, he was filmed on the street in New Orleans distributing literature for the left-wing Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The commission says Oswald made himself president of a fictitious New Orleans branch of the committee. But the incredible killing of Oswald by Jack Ruby in the Dallas police station in full view of the country convinced many people that the rumors of conspiracy were true.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic. Absolute panic. Here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters, the detectives have their guns drawn. Oswald has been shot. There's no question about it. Oswald has been shot.
The findings of the Warren Commission are very direct. It says, quote, there is no credible evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. The commission discovered no evidence that the Soviet Union or Cuba were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Nor did the commission's investigation of Jack Ruby produce any grounds for believing that Ruby's killing of Oswald was part of a conspiracy. The report goes on to say that the conclusion that there was no conspiracy was also reached independently by key members of the cabinet, including then Attorney General Robert Kennedy, J. Edgar Hoover, John McCone, head of the CIA, and James Rowley, chief of the Secret Service. The commission reports its investigation of rumors and speculation reached into every part of the world. Foreign governments, including the Soviet Union and Cuba, cooperated in providing official files concerning Oswald, which the commission checked with American intelligence sources. Rumors that Ruby and Oswald were seen together at the Carousel Club in Dallas were declared by the commission to be untrue. There is no credible evidence that Jack Ruby knew Patrolman Tippit or knew Lee Oswald. Also, there is no evidence of any right-wing plot to assassinate the president.
Much of Oswald's life is known. His career in the Marines, his defection to Russia, his marriage to a Russian girl, and his subsequent return to the United States. We have concentrated on a few specific details to illustrate the commission's report on his possible motive. Here's Tom Pettit.
Lee Harvey Oswald's father died before Lee was born. Oswald's mother moved about a good deal, stayed away from home a great deal, working to support Lee and a brother and a half-brother.
When these children come home, I am working. I have the support of these children. So I'm not the type of mother that has the time, the daytime, to be with the children.
The Warren Commission feels that many of Oswald's own writings give some insight into his character. Oswald, while in Russia, wrote an autobiography of sorts. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in October 1939 in New Orleans, son of an insurance salesman whose early death left a far mean streak of independence brought on by neglect. Entering the U.S. Marine Corps at 17, this streak of independence was strengthened by exotic journeys to Japan, the Philippines. Oswald went on. Immediately after serving out his 3 years in the Marine Corps, he abandoned his American way of life to seek a new life in the USSR. Full of optimism, he stood in the Red Square in the fall of 1959, vowing to see his chosen course through. After, however, 2 years, he said, and a lot of growing up, I decided to return to the USA. Those were Oswald's words. The Warren Commission says that he returned from Russia, not quite 23 years old, bitterly disappointed. His attempt to renounce his citizenship had been a profound rejection of his early life. His return, says the report, testified to the utter failure of what had been the most important act of his life. When he returned with his wife, Oswald had few friends, if any, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Oswald's widow, Marina, talks to NBC News in 1964, when Time and Again continues. The Warren report on the assassination of John F. Kennedy turned up plenty of information about Lee Harvey Oswald. That as a Marine, he had 2 court-martials, one for shooting himself and another for a drunken brawl. That while in the Soviet Union, he attempted suicide. That he had attempted to kill right-wing Army General Edwin Walker in early 1963, and that he had a volatile, deteriorating relationship with his Russian-born wife, Marina.
Sometimes we had good times, sometimes bad times. And I think he really enjoyed when he does some
good thanks for me. And he want to be the same way all the time. But next day, you know, he think about his Cuba again and this book. And I feel looks like this was two people, one person.
Two people, one person is what Marina Oswald said. Marina also told the commission that after they had been in New Orleans a while, Oswald became depressed, and she once found him crying. At about this time, Oswald, using the alias A.J. Heidel, had set up the fictitious chapter of a Fair Play for Cuba committee. According to Marina, he thought that would help him actually get to Cuba. In September of 1963, Oswald went to Mexico City and tried without success to get a transit visa to Cuba, ostensibly en route to Russia. He also was turned down at the Soviet embassy in his effort to get a visa there. He returned to Dallas, and the commission, by the way, says stories of Oswald returning by car with his wife and baby are without foundation. In Dallas, Oswald took a room under the alias of O.H. Lee. His wife was back in Irving with Mrs. Payne. On Monday, November 18th, Oswald called Marina on the telephone. She refused to talk with him again, according to the report.
The weekend before, he was in my house because I want to see him. And he told me the reason why he came to see me in Thursday, because he's homesick. I was really, a little bit mean. I won't talk with him, and he tried to talk with me. He wants if I go to live with him in Dallas. He asked me 3 times about if he rent house. He wants if I stay with him. He wants to keep all family in the same place. He tired to live just himself. But I don't know.
The Warren Commission report says that the next morning when he left to go to Dallas, Lee Oswald left his wedding ring in a cup on the dresser in his room. He left $170 in a wallet on one of the dresser drawers. He took $13.87 with him and a long brown package. The commission does not make any definitive determination of Oswald's motives for assassinating President Kennedy. They do find a number of factors, each of which contributed to his capacity to risk all cruel and irresponsible actions. First, his deep-rooted resentment of all authority, which was expressed in a hostility toward every society in which he lived. Second, his inability to enter into meaningful relationships with people and a continuous pattern of rejecting his environment in favor of new surroundings. Third, his urge to try to find a place in history and despair at times over failures in his various undertakings. 4, his capacity for violence as evidenced by his attempt to kill General Walker. 5, his avowed commitment to Marxism and communism as he understood the terms and developed his own interpretations of them.
Lee Harvey Oswald's mother and his other victim, Texas Governor John Connally, when Time and Again continues. You might wonder why a character such as Lee Harvey Oswald, a communist sympathizer, a former defector, had not been watched more closely by authorities in November of 1963. In fact, the Warren Commission found U.S. intelligence agencies negligent in their surveillance of Oswald. And in an interview with NBC's Herb Kaplow just days after the assassination, Oswald's own mother raised the subject as well.
He is a known, I hate to use the word, but I will use it, character. And all known characters were being screened and would be under surveillance while President Kennedy was making his tour of Dallas. So then why wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, a known defector, not under surveillance? And I deeply regret that he wasn't, because if he had been, he would not have been the accused assassin of President Kennedy, which he then would be alive today, and so would my son. That is very simple deduction.
Along with examining the circumstances surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Warren Commission also made recommendations for the future. Here again is NBC's Frank McGee on September 27, 1964.
Now, to provide more adequate protection for the President, the Commission recommends, among others, 1, that a committee of cabinet members be formed to review and oversee the protective activities of the Secret Service and other federal agencies that assist in safeguarding the president. 2, that the Secret Service completely overhaul its facilities for the advanced detection of potential threats to the president. 3, that it improve its protective measures for motorcades, particularly the searching of buildings along the motorcade route, which had not been done prior to the assassination of Mr. Kennedy. 4, that closer liaison be developed between the Secret Service and other agencies. And 5, that Congress adopt legislation which would make the assassination of the President and the Vice President a federal crime. It is not now. The Commission says, quote, a state of affairs where U.S. authorities have no clearly defined jurisdiction to investigate the assassination of a president is anomalous. And there is a final conclusion, however, that recognizes the impossibility of total security. This commission, its members report, can recommend no procedure for the future protection of our presidents that will guarantee security. If the sole goal were to protect the life of the president, the report says, it could be accomplished with reasonable assurance, despite the multiple roles he must play. But his very position as representative of the people prevents him from effectively shielding himself from the people. He cannot and will not take the precautions of a dictator or of a sovereign. Under our system, measures must be sought to afford security without impeding the president's performance of his many functions. The protection of the president must be thorough but inconspicuous to avoid even the suggestion of a garrison state. The rights of private individuals must not be infringed. If the protective job is well done, its performance will be evident only in the unexceptional fact of its success. Frank McGee, NBC News. Good evening.
The Warren report named Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin of John F. Kennedy, but the commission also found fault elsewhere, in the Secret Service and FBI for letting down their guard, in the local police for shoddy security and grandstanding, and in the press for helping create a surreal, circus-like atmosphere in Dallas. The Warren Commission itself has been a frequent target for criticism and attack over the years. Even Texas Governor John Connally found fault with the report. Here he is speaking with reporters 3 years after the shooting.
I am convinced beyond any doubt that I was not struck by the first bullet. I know that I heard the first shot, that I turned to my right to see what was happening. Seeing nothing, I was in the process of turning to my left, and I was struck by a second shot. The third shot struck the president, but did not strike me. Now, as I said earlier, this testimony was presented to the Warren Commission. They chose to disagree with my interpretation and my memory of what had occurred, and this is their privilege. But I maintain my original view and always shall. I want to make it very clear, however, that simply because I disagree with the Warren Commission on this one detail does not mean that I disagree with the substance of their overall findings. I think the Commission did an outstanding job under very difficult circumstances. I think there was more than half a second between the shots. I think it was probably almost close to 2 seconds between the time President Kennedy was hit with the first shot and the time I was hit.
Well, Governor, are you certain in your own mind as to the direction from which the 2 shots that you heard came from?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What was that direction?
Over my right shoulder, back over my right shoulder from behind us, beyond any question.
3 shots or 2 shots?
I only heard 2.
What about Mrs. Connally?
Ms. Connally has a very definite opinion that all 3 shots came from back over our right shoulder, from behind us, not from the side of us, not from in front of us, not from the bridge, but back over our right shoulder.
The events of November 22nd, 1963 touched few lives as deeply as John Connally's. He was wounded and permanently scarred by a bullet that had passed through the president himself. Connally survived the shooting and survived 30 years of political ups and downs that followed. He died on June 15th, 1993.
In the 60s, he was the governor from Central Casting. Handsome, 6 feet 2 inches tall, an imposing figure even in Texas. And he was President John Kennedy's host on that visit to Dallas in 1963. The assassin's bullets killed Kennedy and badly wounded Connally. Though a lifelong associate of Lyndon Johnson, he served in Richard Nixon's cabinet. But after Johnson's death in 1973, Connally became a Republican. he was accused by a Watergate grand jury of taking bribes and found not guilty. In 1980, he spent millions running for president and wound up with one delegate. Connally made and lost a fortune in the oil and real estate boom and bust in the 80s, then watched a lifetime's possessions auctioned off in a bankruptcy sale. In 1990, he flew to Baghdad to convince Saddam Hussein to release his human shields, and with Texas oil man Oscar Wyatt, Connally flew some of them home. Last month, just before entering the hospital with a fatal lung ailment, he joined an effort to build a horse racing track in Houston. John Connally will be buried in Austin tomorrow. Larry Weidman, NBC News, Houston.
When we come back, a look at long secret CIA documents 30 years after the assassination.
News today on the assassination of President Kennedy 30 years ago this November. Stacks of secret CIA files on the investigation were made public in Washington. No bombshells, but plenty to plow through. There to do that for us today was Tom Pettit, who reported from Dallas for NBC News 30 years ago.
The thousands of documents do show that the CIA was deeply involved in the assassination investigation. Nothing of any other CIA involvement so far. The CIA did hold back another 10,000 pages of ultra-secret material that will be given to a presidential review board. After waiting in line for numbers, reporters and researchers were left grasping for straws in the voluminous material released today. One file from 1963. KGB defector tells CIA the assassination may have been planned by the KGB, but no evidence. The CIA did serious investigating, proving Oswald was on the manifest of a bus trip from Mexico City to Dallas under the name H.O. Lee. But we already knew that. From inside the Soviet Union, it found blurred photos of Oswald and his wife Marina. Oswald had defected to Russia in 1959. We knew that, too. Marina Oswald Porter, Oswald's Russian-born widow, thinks the Kennedy investigation should be reopened.
I know Lee did not do it. Somebody else did.
But of the assassination itself in Dallas, of the national nightmare that resulted, and the murder of Oswald by Jack Ruby in the police station, there is no new light, at least so far. This collection of 800,000 documents at the National Archives contains previously declassified material from the Warren Commission, the FBI, and congressional investigators. One of them is Robert Blakey, a Notre Dame law professor.
There is nothing new in here that I have not seen or read before.
About all the ultra-secret stuff still held back by the CIA, it will be submitted to a presidential review board as soon as the White House appoints one. In any event, all those conspiracy theories will go on and on. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Washington.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy has fueled generations of historians, scholars, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists. Even after all these years, many simply refuse to believe that a small-time nobody like Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone could have cut down a president, changed the course of history, and touched so many lives so deeply. No investigation, no report, no new disclosure is ever likely to change that. That's time and again for now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Pauley, and we're history.